Aisquaitchilseum. Hello, I'm Alex Darcy, and I'm the Associate Dean Research for the Faculty of Humanities at the University of Victoria. As I welcome you to this virtual lecture, I'm in my campus office on the traditional and unceded territory of the Lekwungen. I'm an uninvited guest here, and so I acknowledge the Songhees, the Esquimalt, and the Wasanich peoples, whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. I'm really thrilled to introduce Drs. Mary Elizabeth Leighton and Lisa Surridge today, both professors in the Department of English at UVic. Drs. Leighton and Surridge are longtime colleagues and collaborators. Many fields have a dynamic duo, a set of scholars who collaborate frequently and to exceptional effect. Drs. Leighton and Surridge, both award-winning teachers and researchers, are one such team. Together, they co-edited the Broadview Anthology of Victorian Prose, 1831 to 1901, published in 2012, as well as Victorian Review, an academic journal that specializes in Victorian studies. They also co-authored The Plot Thickens, Illustrated Victorian Serial Fiction from Dickens to Du Maurier, published in 2019, alongside numerous articles and book chapters. Their new project, Great Expectations, Pregnancy in Victorian Fiction. And it is from this latest joint venture that today's presentation emerges. These two are not only academic partners, they're close friends too. They've terrorized each other driving on the wrong side of the road in the UK, traded puppies training woes over many pots of tea, and once, while wearing very similar outfits, traded glasses at a conference. Apparently, many people remarked that something was different about them, but nobody managed to put their finger on just what it was. I've seen a picture of that day, and I have to say, it was a striking look. The magic of their collaborative bond is beautifully on display during this presentation, which examines the considerable scrutiny that Queen Victoria's interesting physical condition received from the national press of the time. As they weave this narrative for you, you'll learn all kinds of things about Victorian pregnancy and Victoria's pregnancy and about Albert as troubadour. In fact, this talk will violate all the social norms of the Victorian era. It will speak clearly and directly about pregnancy. So hold on to your seats and prepare to travel the erstwhile exceedingly impolite journey that details the long-awaited and much speculated birth of Princess Victoria on November 21st, 1840. Thank you and enjoy.
Well, thanks so much, Alex, for that very kind and hilarious introduction. Thank you to Continuing Studies for this invitation to participate in the Dean's Lecture Series. And thanks to you all for coming to this virtual lecture. We're delighted to share the fruits of our recent labors in our research on Victorian pregnancy with you. And I'll hand it over to Lisa to tell you a little bit more about how we'll begin.
So we've started off in our project to answer what seems like a very simple question, but one which we think is very rich. And that is that we all know Victorians had a reputation for being very tactful, perhaps even prudish about the body and sex in particular. And, that view is very well summarized by the critic Cynthia Malone, who says that in the Victorian era, it became not only impolite, but virtually impossible to speak clearly and directly about pregnancy. Our question is that true? So to test that question, we are interested in using Queen Victoria's first pregnancy as something of a case study. And we think it's ideal because it was so high profile and it was so widely reported on. And just to give you an idea of how much scrutiny Victoria was under early in her reign, I want to quote the journal Figaro in London from 1837 that said, if Victoria blows her nose, the penny aligners, that is the journalists, must blow their trumpets with a most sweet echo. So we're interested in what was the echo of her pregnancy? How did Victorians discuss this much awaited and important public as well as private event?
Queen Victoria came to the throne in June 1837, an unmarried older teenager. She had not yet married Albert. That did not happen until February 1840. And when she gave birth to Princess Victoria in November 1840, there had been much press coverage swirling about her pregnancy throughout its duration. Now, Lisa and I, when we began contemplating this topic of Queen Victoria's pregnancy in the press, turned to a modern gestation calendar just to verify exactly when this pregnancy would have occurred. Might it have been a pre-wedding conception, as many Victorians were themselves wondering? And indeed, the contemporary gestation calendar indicates that she likely became pregnant several weeks after her marriage in late February, early March.
So we admitted that we used a modern pregnancy calculator like the one on the left, but we want to introduce you to what the Victorians would have known as a reckoning table. So this is how perhaps Victoria herself would have calculated, or her medical attendants would have calculated her pregnancy. So you can see on the right of your screen here a series of dates and columns. And this says that there's the beginning, BEG, the middle, MID, and the end of a pregnancy. So that tells us right away something very interesting about the Victorians, which is that they didn't actually divide pregnancies into trimesters. They did think in terms of the conception, the quickening, and the birth. So let's just look at how that reckoning table works before we go back to thinking about Victoria. So this is the explanation by Michael Ryan, who's the author of a Manual of Midwifery from 1841. So pretty close, actually, to Victoria's pregnancy in 1840. And here's how he calculates on this. He says that if a woman becomes pregnant around the 14th of March, then the quickening, or the middle, will be somewhere around mid-July, and will have the due date around December. Now, we need to remember that many Victorian women would not actually have known for sure when they conceived. And so, in fact, for many, the confirmation of pregnancy came at the quickening. So they might just have used the 2 columns in this calendar from when they first felt the fetus to the due date. Let's go back now to our overview of our presentation for you. I hand over to Mary Elizabeth for that.
So we've divided our presentation then into 6 parts, and we're going to begin, you may be delighted to know, with this press coverage involving speculation and salacious gossip about whether indeed Queen Victoria was pregnant. And that gossip happens as early as late March and early April. So just in the month following her wedding to Prince Albert. We want then to talk about the specters of earlier royal births and deaths in delivery, the death of the mother in delivery, a stillborn child, particularly in the earlier instance of Princess Charlotte's death, because that story really comes to the fore in the press coverage of Victoria's first pregnancy. We're then going to turn our attention to the June attempted assassination of Victoria by Edward Oxford, because what is fascinating about that coverage is that there is great concern for Queen Victoria's body, but there is a bit of reticence about talking about her pregnant state in that instance, as opposed to the lack of reticence that many newspapers and periodicals show in other coverage. We're then going to turn our attention to the Regency Bill, which is really coverage that runs the duration of her wedding through to the birth of Princess Vicky in November. And this is a bill that concerns the question of who will rule should Victoria die in childbirth, or die at all, but obviously in this case, people are preoccupied with the question of the delivery. We'll then turn to coverage of the labor and delivery of Princess Vicky, who was there, how that act got talked about in the newspaper and covered. And then finally, we'll conclude by looking at press coverage that's very self-conscious about its own fascination with the body of the pregnant Victoria and her labor and childbirth.
So we want to start then with speculation and salacious gossip. So interestingly, speculation in the press on Victoria's possible pregnancy was almost immediate. We've seen that she probably conceived around late February or early March. And by March the 18th, the mayor of Limerick in Ireland had announced at a public gathering that Her Majesty's appearance fully indicated that she was in a fair way of perpetuating the Brunswick line. The Limerick Chronicle broke this news under the heading, "The Queen Enceinte." Enceinte is French for pregnant and was a very common term at the time for pregnancy. So for us, this kind of use of French and then the expression "in a fair way of perpetuating," those might kind of smack of prudishness. But what we've noticed is that the rate of reprinting of this report indicates that the Victorians were deeply interested in this pregnancy and that the press was widely discussing this pregnancy in the following kind of month. So that report about the Queen Enceinte was reprinted in the following newspapers: the Globe, the Times, John Bull, the Norfolk Chronicle, the Royal Cornwall Gazette, the Cheltenham Examiner, the Leicestershire Mercury. So it's fascinating to us to say, on the one hand, there is sort of some obliqueness in the vocabulary, and on the other hand, huge and salacious interest.
And what is fascinating to us about this coverage is that even as newspapers are criticizing the coverage of this, the so-called indecent coverage of these questions of Queen Victoria's potential pregnancy, they are circulating this news by reprinting that material. So the Times criticizes the Globe for what it deems a lack of common decency, but notably it is reprinting the very article published in the Globe, and itself is counting the days since Victoria's wedding to Albert. Her Majesty's marriage took place on the 10th of February, and the Limerick address was printed on the 18th of March, just 37 days after. Those italics are not mine and Lisa's. They belong to the Times, which is actively drawing readers' attention to the number of days it has been since the wedding. And so, as you see in the Leicestershire Mercury and Norfolk Chronicle examples as well, there is an ostensible criticism of other newspapers being too gossipy and too interested in this information. But at the same time, these very newspapers are reproducing those stories themselves. And so gossip is circulating rampantly in the mainstream press, even as each newspaper is purporting to rise above the fray of that kind of gossip and to decry the indecency of this kind of reporting.
We want to turn now to the comedic and satirical press, where there were no such reservations. So we'll just give you a flavor of the kind of salacious reports that you get in that. So here we have a little comic for you. You can recognize Prince Albert in his nightshirt. You might not be recognizing, but this is Victoria's nightcap that he's got in his hands. He's leaping out of bed and he's grasping at a vision of two things. One, a baby, the suggestion there of fertility, and two, money bags, because there's a very common criticism of Albert in the press that by marrying Victoria, he's pulled himself out of poverty and he is now going to be a kind of bloodsucker on the English state. There's also a critique here of him being German. We get his accent being mocked. Ah, mein Gott, I have broken all my bones. Methought I saw my son, the Prince of Wales. So here we're getting this attack on Albert, but at the same time, the real suggestion of him as being, the person that is going to get Victoria pregnant.
And so, as Lisa was saying earlier, we may frequently think of the Victorians as prudish, but these kinds of comic cartoons and stories that circulated in the more satirical press were really quite astonishingly explicit, as I think this example makes abundantly clear. So this is a sort of riff on a play script, a little dramatic dialogue that gets produced in the Age in April 1840. And here you have a scene being set in the boudoir. The ladies of the palace are chatting, and we have Her Majesty playing at cup and ball and teaching Prince Albert how to hit the hole. Now, cup and ball is a game that still exists. We have here on screen an image of a 19th century sort of set of cup and ball. You try to capture the ball sort of in the cup, right? And this becomes a quite implicitly lewd allusion to the sexual act. Moreover, in the second paragraph of this little script, we have a baroness rising and using French. As Lisa pointed out, the French term enceinte quite explicitly alluded to pregnancy. And there was a sense that, French was a language known by educated and wealthier people. She says, "Vous n'y serez jamais, mon prince. You will never be there. You cannot attraper le trou. You cannot trap the hole." And so there's this sort of lewd playing on, punning on the French word trou. As Alex pointed out in her introduction, the troubadour, Prince Albert is no troubadour. After all the fine poetry, what a shame, quel dommage. So there's this playing on that term, and this quite kind of explicit allusion to vaginal imagery here in this whole little scenario that gets written up in the satirical press.
So we want to show you another kind of flavor of that sexual imagery. This is actually from August, when Victoria was widely known to be pregnant. It's a critique of Albert not being very charitable. And it says that the statement that Albert can never be induced to lay down a single shilling for any object of charity is contradicted by the fact that he lays down a sovereign almost every night. So you'll recognize this is the title of our talk. We were quite astonished by some of the sexual jokes about Victoria, and we wanted to just show them to you to say, it's interesting that the Victorians have this reputation for prudery, because actually these jokes are very, very explicit and very salacious, surprisingly so to us.
Even in the mainstream press, which obviously is, not so comical and explicit, there is a strong attention to and focus on Victoria's body. We see in much of this coverage the body under scrutiny. And so in the same way that we might think of attention to baby bumps sort of in the gossip press these days, we see Victorians paying attention to potential signs of pregnancy. The first example from the Leeds Mercury, in which Victoria has left off equestrian exercise. So she's no longer riding out on her horse. The Manchester Courier tells us there are to be no more state balls, so there will be no more dancing. She has been professionally advised to avoid all violent exercise, right? So these become signs of the state of her body. That article notes that Victoria was late for church one day and exceedingly pale. So there's this attention to sort of her pallor, her activity or lack of activity. And the Bradford Observer notes that it is whispered in circles that Her Majesty is in a way likely to prevent the succession to the throne from passing to any other but the direct line. So the intimation here is that she is pregnant. That is, should she die without a child, the throne would have passed elsewhere. But she is likely pregnant. That is what's happening in the whispering circles. So although there isn't lewdness here, as we saw in the previous examples, there is nevertheless a preoccupation with Victoria's body.
Just continuing this theme of the body under scrutiny, we see that by the 31st of May, there's mention of the fact that the Queen is suffering from weakness of the ankles and has to be carried by a chair up and down the staircase when she goes to the opera. There's the Westmoreland Gazette by June is reporting that the ministerial papers, that is those closest to the royal family, are announcing with confidence that the Queen is enceinte. Notice that word again, it's very, very common for pregnancy. And again, they use the French word for her accouchement, that is that her lying in or her due date is anticipated in November. So we also get in June, The Age reporting that the Queen did not stand at the last drawing room reception, but that she sat on a kind of music stool that was concealed beneath her train. So clearly, again, Victoria is being watched for signs of pregnancy, signs of weight gain.
This is a really sort of fascinating example. We're back in the comedic press and the satirical press in the satirist. And here we have a paragraph about a triple-decker warship, which is named the Queen, right? And the preamble to this paragraph about how that ship is approaching completion, her grand magazine is fitting amidship, her forecockpit is extraordinarily capacious. This whole paragraph is prefaced with a sentence that says there needs no comment on the following paragraph. So the paragraph becomes a kind of implicit analogy in June to size, the Queen's broadening girth as she enters this point in her mid-pregnancy. And so although the paper says there needs no comment, it does implicitly, however, comment upon her size.
We want to leave salacious jokes now and turn to a more serious topic that really haunted Victoria's pregnancy, and that is the subject of death. So Mary Elizabeth already talked a little bit about this in the overview, which is that the public representation of Victoria's first pregnancy referred back to the death of the beloved Princess Charlotte in November 1817. She died at Claremont House in Esher following 50 hours of labor and having given birth to a stillborn son. And that stillborn son was the presumptive heir to the kingdom. So this death was greeted with public mourning. In 2 days, the British had lost the 2 heirs to the throne, one to maternal death and one to perinatal death. The Times said this was a national calamity. The law courts closed, the docks closed, and the accoucheur, that is the person who attended Charlotte during her labor, shot himself. So the location Claremont became a kind of shorthand for this death, and we see that in the reporting of Victoria's pregnancy. But before we go to that, let's just take you through the line of succession so you can see the relationship between Charlotte and Victoria.
Importantly, Charlotte's death in childbirth in 1817 started a succession crisis in which George III's other unmarried sons they rushed to marry and produce a legitimate heir. So you have the future William IV marrying Adelaide in a double wedding with the Duke of Kent and Victoria's mother, right, in order to ensure the line of British succession. Adelaide and William had several stillborn or children who died in infancy. There were miscarriages. And so it was actually quite unexpected that Victoria would sort of make it to the throne. This is just to give you some sense of the importance of pregnancy and childbirth in this succession map, and also to contextualize that story that Lisa told you about Charlotte's own death in childbirth.
So you can see how Victoria could become seen as a kind of second Charlotte. Charlotte was 21 when she died, and Victoria was 21 during her first pregnancy. Charlotte would have been queen after her father, the future George IV. Victoria was already queen. Both women were carrying the heir to the throne. And adding to these associations, Victoria and Albert took to spending time at Claremont House, which the press took to kind of increase the association between Victoria and this calamitous death.
So in June 1840, for example, we have the Leicestershire Mercury reporting on Victoria and Albert's visit to Claremont House, where Charlotte died. So Claremont becomes a shorthand for death in childbirth, sort of the death of the heir in that same moment. But also the press becomes preoccupied with Victoria and Albert's own interest in Claremont. And the press is often wondering, if Prince Albert is, as they say here, cognizant of all the facts. As Lisa had pointed out in that earlier comedic cartoon, the press could be viciously xenophobic about Albert's German heritage, and they wondered if he knew the full backstory of Charlotte's death and the association not only for the royal family, but importantly for the public between Claremont House and death in childbirth.
So you might be asking yourself, well, how likely was it that Victoria would die in childbirth? And you can see from this graph here that maternal mortality is kind of hovering through the whole of the 19th century and actually into the early 20th century at about 4 to 5 deaths per 1,000 births. And it remains kind of relatively stable until this sudden plunge. And that plunge is the introduction of sulfa drugs in 1935, followed by antibiotics thereafter. And that's when that death rate goes down. What's important to know about Victoria is that as a woman of higher socioeconomic background, she was not as likely to die in childbirth because she would not be likely to have the pelvic deformities from malnutrition and lack of vitamin D that caused many maternal deaths. That is where literally the pelvis would not allow the fetus to be born.
So we want to turn our attention now to the assassination attempt on Victoria's life, to which I alluded earlier in our overview. At this point, she was 4 months pregnant, and an 18-year-old unemployed man fired 2 pistols at her when she was out in a carriage with Albert. Importantly, she was unharmed, but to our fascination, the coverage takes a quite different turn than earlier quite explicit coverage of and scrutiny of her body in this moment, because there's a sort of shying away from explicitness about her pregnancy, even as there is concern about the risk to her body from the shock of this assassination attempt.
So just to give you a sense of how widespread the press coverage was, we see here 2 different representations of the event. They're both, of course, drawn after the fact, but the crucial information is conveyed in both, that there's a kind of point blank shooting at Victoria and Albert in an open carriage. It was debated whether or not, in fact, the gun was loaded, but bullets were found at the scene. So it did appear that, in fact, although no one was hit, that there had actually been live ammunition in the gun.
And the press coverage of this event then gives thanks for the life of Queen Victoria, the fact that she has been spared in this assassination attempt. There are many addresses of congratulations that peers gather to give, that particular cities and mayors and villages gather to give. The Lord Mayor of London sort of addresses the providential escape of Her Majesty and her illustrious consort. But as I said earlier, what's fascinating to me and Lisa about this coverage is that there is no mention of the pregnancy in these formal addresses. So there is thanks given for the sparing of her life, even though there has been wide reporting that she's expecting a child. There is very little mention of the pregnancy, with a few rare exceptions, about which Lisa will speak to us now.
So one of those exceptions is actually in the Irish press, in the Freeman's Journal, and it's a summary of a sermon given by a Reverend Dr. Miley, a sermon of thanksgiving for the escape of the Queen. And he mentions the pregnancy. He says that the regicide had taken aim for that heart that is palpitating with double life. And they're identifying a threat to the Queen's life, but also the threat to her pregnancy and the possible miscarriage that could have resulted.
We have found two other allusions or potential allusions to miscarriage in the press. On the left of the screen, you'll see a poem printed in the era, God Saved the Queen. And you see there's an allusion to no dark stain of blood that hath dimmed her star. Now, of course, the dark stain of blood might well simply refer to the blood that would have flowed from the penetration sort of the bullet wherever she had been wounded, which she was not. But Lisa and I have wondered if the dark stain of blood might also implicitly suggest to readers that this averted potential of a miscarriage. Certainly in the right-hand excerpt that you see from the satirist, there's a much more explicit allusion to the miscarriage. We have here that the joke is now current in the clubs about the miscarriage, right? That there was, they were out in the carriage, but there has been a miss. And so there's this fascinating, much more explicit allusion.
And another allusion, actually in the same paper, the satirist, is a pun on the word heir, A-I-R, and then the word H-E-I-R. And so this goes, Oxford discharged his pistols, some declare, not at the Queen or Albert, but the heir. So there you have that idea that the regicide might actually have been aiming at the pregnancy itself, at the fetus itself. So interestingly then, what we see in this assassination attempt is that in the official statements by peers and by the mayor, no mention of the pregnancy. We have to go to the satirical press or to the standard press for a very oblique mention in that idea of the stain of blood. We want to turn now to the idea of the Regency Bill, which brought the threat of Victoria's death in childbirth right to the center of press coverage.
And so the Regency Bill, in fact, as I said earlier, suggestions about contemplating a Regency Bill had been alive in the press from February all the way through until the birth of Princess Vicky in November. And the question was, at first, what would happen if Queen Victoria died, and where would succession go? If she were to die in childbirth and be survived by an infant, there was concern in some parts that Prince Albert, might become the regent, and there was some disagreement about that. So the House of Lords needed to get together and really make a plan about what would happen. The fact that there is this plan that needs to happen means that the press and Parliament are extensively and publicly discussing this potential of her death in childbirth in order to sort of draft a Regency Bill, which will make clear what is to happen if she dies in childbirth and the child is born, who will act as regent sort of in this moment before the child comes of age. And the fact that this Regency Bill is being contemplated means that there is active discussion about not only Victoria's pregnant body, but also her potential death in childbirth throughout this period.
So just to be clear, there were four possibilities that were kind of in play. The first would be the happy one, that both the baby lived and Victoria lived. The second possibility, that the baby died but Victoria lived, was, from the point of view of producing an heir to the throne, a reasonable one, because Victoria could presumably get pregnant again. The third one was the worst scenario, which was what had happened with Princess Charlotte and the death of her child, which is that the baby died and Victoria died. And then the fourth one is the one that produces the need for the Regency Bill, which would be that the baby lived and Victoria died. And then who was going to rule during that baby's infancy until they attained a coming of age?
So Lisa had talked a little bit earlier about maternal mortality rates. And in fact, this graph shows you that infant mortality rates were much higher than maternal mortality rates in the period. And they amounted to roughly 149 deaths per 1,000 live births pretty much throughout the 19th century. So in fact, as we've noted here, chances were more than 1 in 10 that the infant would die.
And just to remind you about maternal mortality rates, they're about 4 to 6 per 1,000, but probably lower in the case of a woman of higher economic standing. So we end up with kind of four possibilities, and they're kind of around. Number 2 is about a higher chance, 149 out of 1,000, that the baby dies, right? And then this one that produces the Regency Bill is about 4 to 6 out of 1,000, but that's the one that everyone's concerned about. So what we notice is that the word Claremont sort of comes up again, standing in for death in the moment of the Regency Bill. And I want to turn over to Mary Elizabeth to talk about this.
So as we noted earlier, Claremont then becomes associated with Princess Charlotte's death in childbirth. And you have here the age in the summer of 1840, talking about that ominous name of Claremont, with which that house is therefore associated, right? So there's the association of Claremont with Charlotte, of Claremont with death in childbirth, and this question of the potential death of Victoria in childbirth, and therefore sort of the need to contemplate the Regency Bill. We note in the next slide that even into July, when Victoria is 4 months pregnant, we have this single word Claremont evoking much anxiety for writers and readers of the Victorian press, right? Who are proclaiming, we're aware of the Regency Bill's extreme delicacy. We're compelled to urge the constitutional necessity for providing for an event which the single word Claremont tells us has happened and may happen again. So Claremont becomes a kind of shorthand for the death of Victoria, in the potential death of Victoria in childbirth. And it becomes a way of talking obliquely about that prospect in relation to the Regency Bill.
So on the 13th of July, Victoria actually took it upon herself to solve this problem by actually addressing the House of Lords in a letter and giving them sort of her blessing on establishing a Regency Bill. As she wrote, "The uncertainty of human life and a deep sense of my duty to my people render it incumbent upon me to recommend you to consider contingencies which may hereafter take place, and to make such provision as will in any event secure the exercise of royal authority." So there's her permission to do the Regency Bill. And I'm going to pass over to Mary Elizabeth again just to wrap this up.
Here we have the press alluding to a painfully delicate subject, which is the Regency Bill. And we're sort of back in a similar situation as we noted earlier, when we had the press criticizing other newspapers for gossiping and speculating about the Queen's body even as they were circulating that information. So here we have the press saying, we need, there needs to be discussion about the Regency Bill, but it's painfully delicate to talk about this because it evokes the possibility of the Queen's death in childbirth. Here we have Belle's life alluding to the coming emergency. That is her going into labor and delivery. And I think that term, the coming emergency, really makes vivid for us as 21st century readers, the potential emergency that labor and childbirth could be for women in the 19th century when the outcome was not so assured. But this coverage also suggests how it was perhaps more awkward and more delicate to talk about the Queen's death in childbirth than it was to talk about her pregnant state. So we have said earlier, we think of the Victorians as prudish, and yet everywhere there was press coverage about Queen Victoria's pregnant body. There was a certain reticence about talking about her death, however, and that has interested us.
We want to turn now to our fifth topic, which is her actual labor and delivery. And looking forward to that, we have this lovely little cartoon from the satirical press. This is October 17th. And we have here the recognizable figures of John Bull in the middle, and that's the sort of traditional representation of England. Victoria here with her bulky figure tactfully hidden behind a fence, and Albert here who is watering a parsley bed. That might not seem so obvious and sexual to us, but the parsley bed was a place where Victorian children were told that babies came from, that they were brought out of the parsley bed with a golden shovel. So John Bull addresses here Mr. Saxe-Goth, which is a reference to Albert's German ancestry, and says, "Look how forward the parsley looks. When do you think the parsley will be productive, Mr. Saxe-Goth?" And he says, "I think about November, Mr. Bull, if nothing intervened to stunt it." So here we have this rather sexualized image of Albert kind of producing this very fertile bed of parsley and saying it's going to be productive in November. And that's the first of these pretty overt references to Victoria's due date.
In this excerpt from the Standard, published on the day that Victoria did give birth, we have an account that has clearly been written before the childbirth has occurred, right? And so we have a sense of the publication of this newspaper as labor and delivery perhaps has begun, right? We have the detail that the Queen was taken rather poorly last night, about 9 o'clock. All the medical attendants were summoned to Buckingham Palace, as well as other great officers of state. And so there's a certain summoning of individuals to the palace after she has taken poorly. And we get toward the end of the excerpt an allusion to Her Majesty's accouchement perhaps taking place. If it takes place, the happy event will be announced by firing the Tower guns. So there's an anticipation of what will happen should the accouchement, that is, the labor and delivery, occur. But notably, this is a lot of detail for the moment before childbirth.
And now we have the announcement of Princess Victoria's birth under the headline Accouchement of the Queen, which again, as we said, was a common expression used in English for a woman being brought to bed or brought to delivery. There was a stopping of the press of the major newspapers. Here we have the Era saying, "We stop the press to announce with delight the above most happy event." And we get a surprisingly overt account of the labor, that she was early this forenoon seized with the usual symptoms, which continued to increase with all the appearances of favorable termination, and that she gave birth at 2 o'clock to a daughter. So notice, though, that right away we go back to counting days. Her Majesty's marriage, it will be remembered, took place on Monday, the 10th of February, 9 months and 11 days since. So even now, Victoria is not able to escape the intimation of her tremendous fertility and even the sort of questioning of counting those days.
Here we have some coverage from the satirical press that is really playing on sort of allusions to make some jokes about the birth moment. On the left, you've got Lie and Deliver, a sort of poetic ditty that appears in the satirist. God preserve little Vic, that is Princess Vicky, and all fortitude give her. When Dame Nature cries stand, we mean lie and deliver. Guess that's actually little Vic, Queen Victoria. This is a riff on stand and deliver, right? The terms that were articulated apparently by highwaymen when they stopped a carriage. They would pull a carriage over, and when they were asking for objects of value from the travelers in the carriage, they would say stand and deliver. So here we have Dame Nature sort of in the role of the highwayman saying, when she cries stand, we mean lie and deliver, right? So this implication that Victoria needs to lie and deliver. And then you have another sort of horsey allusion on the right-hand side of the slide, where we have the satirist proclaiming, may Her Majesty's reign prove essentially a bearing reign. So this is an allusion to the bearing reign of a horse, but we've got a sort of pun on the bearing reign, right? In that they are hoping that Victoria will have a long reign that will be fruitful in terms of children, that she will bear many children.
We want to just turn back to the account of her labor. The press announced that the palace had been kept in quietness and that any kind of bands or other noise were forbidden. And there's an account of Victoria's firmness and composure during labor, and that she was cheerful and she was patient in submission to her sufferings in all respects consistent with the well-known attributes of her character. And we also get an account of a lady in waiting bringing the, quote, young stranger into a room where the Privy Council was assembled. The young stranger being a word that was, or an expression that was very common for a newborn child.
Now, there may have been an effort to keep the palace quiet and to keep the area around the palace quiet, but there were certainly a lot of people there to keep quiet. Here we have some coverage about who was in attendance in the labor room and the adjoining chambers. So we're told that Prince Albert and Victoria's mother, the Duchess of Kent, are there, along with the medical practitioners from Sir James Clark and Dr. Lowcock to others. Right in the room with Victoria. In the adjoining room, to which the door remains open from the labor and delivery room, we find all manner of officials, from the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Bishop of London to the Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs, the Secretary of State for the Colonies, the Earl of Albemarle, and so on. So many people gathering in the adjoining room. And this harkens back to an old tradition in which people sort of, such officials gathered in order to ensure the line of succession, and that in fact it would be the actual queen giving birth to this child. Then there's a further anteroom beyond that in which there are people in waiting, the lady of the bedchamber, the lord in waiting, equerries, and so on. So this gives you some sense of the number of people who are in attendance at this moment, but also the extensive coverage of and enumeration of these people in the press.
There's a lovely cartoon we want to show you from the Penny Satirist, and this gives you a sense of the ludicrous number of people who are there when the Princess Victoria is brought out to be displayed. You can see her right here in the middle of the table, and all these important people, you know, including the Archbishop of Canterbury, are bending over to examine this new baby. And back over to Mary Elizabeth for some of the coverage of Victoria's labor.
This is an interesting poem to us because there is an allusion to Claremont here, sort of in the age in November. We have that allusion to Claremont's fatal morning, and she too had become a wedded wife. She too must bear the woman's pang. And so there is this allusion to sort of the pain of labor. For the most part, the coverage of the labor and delivery tends to enumerate, as we've said, who is there, sort of the events as they unfold. And there isn't necessarily huge attention to sort of the private nature of, or Queen Victoria's vantage on her own labor. But here we have a sort of rare exception in this allusion to Claremont, coupled with the coverage of the birth, along with this allusion to the woman's pang and the sort of agonizing cries of a woman in childbirth.
There are also references to the question of whether Victoria was earlier, well, that is the Princess of Victoria, was delivered earlier than expected. So it seems as if the counting of days really continued. There's a suggestion that they had to quickly get the cot in. It had been ordered. It was a beautiful cot in the shape of a nautilus shell, but it wasn't there yet, which suggested to the press that in fact this little stranger had arrived early and that there might have been a miscalculation. You see that pun on the unmarried status of the miss. Now, we have actually looked at the reckoning tables, and as we've said, that even on the Victorian reckoning tables, they would have indicated a February 14th conception date, 4 days after the marriage. So it doesn't seem to us that there's any argument for Victoria having conceived before the wedding, but that there's definitely a sense that satirical press is suggesting that that could have been the case.
A week after Princess Vicky's birth, there is also the satirical press sort of imagining further births. So here we have John Bull's connubial vision for 1850. And in fact, we've noted that this cartoon is quite prescient in showing Victoria and Albert with 9 children. They did eventually have 9 children together. But this cartoon is predicting that that is all going to occur before 1850. That is, that Queen Victoria is going to be pretty much pregnant for the duration of the following decade. In fact, she gave birth for the last time in 1857. She was just a month shy of 38. This was just about 4 years before Albert died in 1861. But what's interesting about this cartoon is the way that it speculates forward about her fertility and about the potential of future pregnancies.
So we want to leave the subject of Victoria's pregnancy and fertility now and actually talk to you a little bit about what the press said about its own coverage. So one of the most striking articles to us was from the 5th of December with the Bristol Mercury looking back on the press coverage of the pregnancy, and it described the detailing of the royal birth in the newspapers as it having been with minute particularity. And they particularly drew attention to the question of whether it was really necessary to have all those people present in the palace when the Queen gave birth. They said that this custom of ascertaining whether the heir was really emerging from the body of the Queen was repugnant to common sense and also repugnant to dignity.
In this excerpt from the Newcastle Journal, we have a little bit of poetry. This is one of 3 sonnets by Sir Morgan O'Doherty. And there is a quite explicit self-consciousness on the part of this poem about the press coverage of Victoria in her pregnancy and in the moment of labor and delivery. We get these 3 lines. We read it in the papers every day. Yours and your royal mother's health announcing by Clark and Blagden, Ferguson and Lowcock. Those are the medical men, right, who are in attendance. So this is a poem sort of addressed to the Princess Royal that is very self-aware about the extent to which the press itself is covering Queen Victoria's pregnancy and the birth of Princess Vicky.
So given that Victorians read in the paper every day about Victoria's pregnant body, what's the takeaway? Well, for us, the first takeaway is that it was certainly not impossible for Victorians to discuss pregnancy, and that the view of the Victorians that we have inherited may in fact be a false one. We know that they contemplated their sovereign's pregnant body at length throughout 1840, and that they indulged in some very lewd jokes that I would actually be surprised to see in our contemporary press about royalty. We also can note that their vocabulary really differs from ours. We would have found little of this coverage if we had looked for the term pregnant. In fact, it's interesting to see it doesn't come up once in this presentation. There are references to the Queen being enceinte, to her being in an interesting condition, to her being confined, to her approaching her accouchement, but the word pregnant doesn't come up. I think we need to notice that as part of this press coverage, they discussed her possible conception date, her possible premarital conception, her swelling body, her weak ankles, her weight gain, her looking like a triple decker, her possible miscarriage, and the details of her labor and delivery, as well as her seemingly very fertile condition and her sex life with Albert. So really not reticent at all. So our conclusion this far into our study is that we're going to have to revise our account of the Victorians as prudes if we're going to take account properly of this type of very public discussion of pregnancy.
Thanks so much for joining us for this tour of Queen Victoria's first pregnancy in the Victorian periodical press. It's been such a delight to be able to share our research findings with all of you, and our thanks to Continuing Studies for the kind invitation to come and speak to you all about the research that we find so enlivening and fascinating.
Thank you so much.